Welcome back to the Weird and Unexplained with John, the show where we dig into the strange, the mysterious, and the stories that make you look twice at the night sky. I'm John, and today we're talking about one of the most fascinating topics in UFO lore, the three most commonly discussed types of aliens: the Greys, Reptilians, and Insectoids. Now, before we get into it, let's be clear. There is no verified scientific proof that any of these beings actually exist. But in the world of the UFO reports, alleged abduction stories, and conspiracy theories, these are the names of that kind of come up and again. So the real question is not just what are they supposed to be, but why do many people describe them in such similar ways? Let's start with the most famous of the three, the Greys. Greys are usually described as small, thin beings with large heads, oversized black eyes, little or no visible ears, and a pale gray skin tone. They're often linked to abduction stories, especially accounts where people claim they were taken aboard a spacecraft, examined, or communicated with telepathically. What's interesting about the gray alien archetype is how consistent the description is across decades of reports. That has led some researchers to wonder whether this image comes from a shared cultural source, a psychological experience, or something people genuinely believe that they've encountered. Now, here's the big question: what might we learn from the Greys if they were actually real? A lot of believers think Greys may represent a species far more advanced than us in technology, biology, and maybe even in consciousness. If that were true, they might teach us about gravity manipulation, genetics, energy systems, or even nonverbal communication. In other words, they wouldn't just be visitors, they could be a mirror showing us how far life can evolve. Now, the next is we're going to get into is what the we call the reptilians. And this is kind of where things get darker, and at least in the public imagination it does. Reptilians are usually described as humanoid beings with reptile like features: scaly skin, slit pupils, sharp features, and sometimes a shape shifting ability. In some stories, they're said to be secret rulers operating behind the scenes in government, finance, or even global systems. Now, unlike the Greys, who are often portrayed as curious observers, the reptilians are usually described as powerful, calculating, and emotionally cold. That's part of what makes them so unsettling. Should we be afraid of them? If you're talking about the legend, the fear comes from the idea of manipulation, control, and hidden influence. But in a more grounded sense, the real danger may be less about literal reptile beings and more about how the stories reflect human fears of secrecy, power, and losing control over our own world. Then there are the insectoids, probably the least discussed of the three, but easily one of the most fascinating. These beings are often described as insect like, with segmented bodies, multiple limbs, large eyes, and a very alien hive like presence. In some accounts, they seem intelligent, highly organized, and far less emotionally expressive than humans. Some people describe insectoids as observers, others as workers, and in a few stories, even a species with a collective consciousness. That idea alone is wild to even think about. What would a civilization look like if inadvertently this all happened, or individuality mattered less and with the group? Would they value efficiency over like emotion, cooperation over personality? If grays are the mystery and reptilians are the power fantasy of fear symbol, insectoids may represent something even stranger, a completely different way of being alive. So, should we be afraid of any of these alien types? Honestly, fear is probably the wrong starting point. Curiosity is better. These stories are important because they reveal what humans wonder about most: intelligence, survival, control, and what might exist beyond our Earth. If any of these beings were real, the most important question wouldn't be, are they monsters? It would be, what kind of civilization creates life like this? And what can that tell us about ourselves? And if they're not real, then they still matter, right? Because they show us how deeply humans need to explain the unknown. That's going to do it for us today on this episode of The Weird and Unexplained with John. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the gray aliens, reptilians, and insectoids, make sure to like, subscribe, and follow for more strange stories, UFO mysteries, and paranormal theories of the unexplained phenomenon. Because around here, we don't just ask what's out there, we ask why it matters. I'm John.